America will never be a socialist country, declared Donald Trump in his 2019 State of the Union address given to a joint session of Congress. The president clearly believed that fear of such a radical transformation would help him win re-election against the Democratic Party, in which socialists like Bernie Sanders were growing in numbers and influence. The former president and most of his political allies are probably unaware that nearly 2 centuries earlier, a wealthy socialist from abroad spoke before the same body. The friendly reception he received suggests that the philosophy of economic equality and cooperation instead of competition may not be un-American at all. During the winter of 1825, Robert Owen, a rich manufacturer from Wales, gave 2 addresses, each about 3 hours long, to joint sessions of Congress. There was, he told the lawmakers, an urgent need to establish a new system of society, one that would be based upon principles of strict justice and impartial kindness. Owen condemned the reigning economic order, which he called the trading system, as selfish and inhumane at its core. It trained people to obtain advantages over others, he argued, and gave a very injurious surplus of wealth and power to the few, while exacting poverty and subjection on the many. Owen predicted the coming of a new order that would liberate Americans from their plight. An economy organized for mutual benefit would enable men and women to leave the irrationality of relentless, often violent competition behind them. In the new system, he promised, union and cooperation will supersede individual interest. The legislators treated Owen and his ideas with great respect. Several Supreme Court justices came to hear him. So did the outgoing president, James Monroe, and the incoming president, John Quincy Adams. Because neither Thomas Jefferson nor James Madison, who were then quite elderly, could leave their Virginia estates, Owen brought his message to them. He paid a visit to John Adams up in Massachusetts as well. Every living president at the time was thus willing to hear the visionary radical's sharp critique of the capitalist society emerging both in the United States and across the Atlantic. Their curiosity was a sign that the market system, for all its promise of plenty, was not yet a settled reality defended by all men of wealth and standing. Robert Owen soon gave a name to the new system he advocated. He called it Socialism, and the term quickly caught on across the globe. Although future socialists would never enjoy such an elite audience in the United States, their ideas and the movements they built remained part of the mainstream of American history. Most have been committed to democracy, both as an electoral system and as the vision of a future in which ordinary people, in all their diversity, would make the key decisions in their workplaces and communities, as well as at the polling booth that affected their lives and the fate of their society. Like it or not, socialism has been as impossible to separate from the narrative of the nation's history as the capitalist economy itself, and often posed the most prominent alternative to it. Socialists were also energetic advocates of federal and state policies such as Social Security, on which most Americans have come to rely. Conservative politicians and commentators take quite a different view. For them, socialism has meant only a hankering for state tyranny and brazen assaults on property rights that, together, threaten the beliefs every patriotic citizen holds dear. For the right, socialists are the sworn enemies of freedom and democracy, according to Representative Tom Cole, a Republican from Oklahoma. They defy the national creed that the ultimate sovereign power in the U.S. lies with the people. The congressman might be surprised to learn that, a little more than a century ago, his own state had been home to one of the strongest contingents of socialists in America. In 1912, 1/6 of Oklahoma voters cast their ballots for Eugene Debs, a former railroad union leader who ran for president on the Socialist Party SP ticket. Debs drew a little less than half as many votes in Oklahoma that year as did William Howard Taft, the White House incumbent. Soon there were then 6 socialists in the state legislature. More than 3,000 Sooners belonged to the party, 1 of every 300 adults in the state. Part of their attraction to socialism was practical. The Oklahoma Party appealed to small farmers, then the majority of residents, with a program that featured a plan for the state government to purchase arable land for the use of those willing to cultivate it, and vowed to remove all property taxes on farms worth less than $1,000. State banks and warehouses would help growers stay in business. And nearly all socialists, like most other Oklahomans, were devout Christians. They flocked to yearly encampments that blended a faith in Jesus with a belief in socialism. At one gathering, a preacher proclaimed, Christ Church was a working-class church, and cited the verse from Ecclesiastes that decrees, the profit of the earth is for all. The passion for reform that moved many Oklahomans to vote for socialists or look favorably on their ideas was not unique to that prairie state. Socialists, then and later, played a major role in initiating and rallying support for changes that most Americans have no desire to reverse. These include women's right to vote, Medicare, the minimum wage, workplace safety laws, universal health insurance, and civil rights for all races and genders. All were once considered radical ideas, but vast majorities now consider them the cornerstones of a decent society. Americans also overwhelmingly favor curbs on the power of big business that conservatives, since the 19th century, have condemned as socialist. Most citizens believe that the super-rich should pay much higher taxes than the middle class. They believe that businesses should be subject to rules that require them to act responsibly, and that banks shouldn't engage in predatory lending. They also agree that energy corporations shouldn't endanger the planet and public health by emitting carbon-based pollution. Companies, they believe, should be required to guarantee that consumer products like cars, food, and toys are safe, and that companies pay decent wages and provide safe workplaces. Another way to gauge the influence of socialism in U.S. history is to list some of the prominent American writers, artists, intellectuals, activists, and scientists who either publicly embraced the label or favored a socialist blueprint for the nation. It's quite a distinguished roster. At various times, it has included Ralph Waldo Emerson, Walter Lippmann, John Dewey, Charles and Mary Beard, W.E.B. Du Bois, Jack London, Carl Sandburg, Upton Sinclair, Theodore Dreiser, Helen Keller, John Reed, Eugene O'Neill, Randolph Bourne, Florence Kelley, Isadora Duncan, Thorstein Veblen, Walter Rauschenbusch, Clarence Darrow, Max Eastman, George Bellows, John Sloan, Charlie Chaplin, Ernest Hemingway, John Steinbeck, Orson Welles, Norman Mailer, Woody Guthrie, and Jacob Lawrence. Two of the most influential labor leaders in U.S. history, Walter Reuther and A. Philip Randolph, were also open about their sympathy for socialism. So, at some points in their lives, were Margaret Sanger, Betty Friedan, and Gloria Steinem, a trio who did much to create the modern feminist movement. Several of these people remain controversial today, but it would be impossible to write a history of American culture that did not devote attention to nearly every one of them. And conservatives who view socialism as unpatriotic might also ponder why Francis Bellamy, author of the Pledge of Allegiance to the Flag in 1892, was an avowed Christian socialist. The world-famous physicist Albert Einstein and Charles Steinmetz, who developed the alternating current vital to machines that run on electricity, also expressed a fondness for the socialist vision. I am convinced, wrote Einstein in 1949, that there is only one way to eliminate these grave evils of capitalism, namely, through the establishment of a socialist economy accompanied by an educational system which would be oriented towards social goals. In such an economy, the means of production are owned by society itself and are utilized in a planned fashion. What's more, the only non-president to have a federal holiday named after him favored both a massive program by the government to create a job for every citizen who could not find one in the private sector, and the abolition of poverty in the entire nation, as well as complete equality of the races. In a 1961 speech to the Negro American Labor Council, he proclaimed, "Call it democracy or call it democratic socialism, but there must be a better distribution of wealth within this country for all God's children." Such views help explain why conservatives opposed a holiday dedicated to Martin Luther King Jr. as long as they did. So if individual socialists and their proposals gained a good deal of popularity throughout American history, why didn't socialist parties fare better in the electoral arena? During the first 2 decades of the 20th century, several thousand members of the Socialist Party of America did win a share of local power, from the mayor of Milwaukee to the mayor of the little town of Antlers, Oklahoma. Yet only 2 socialists became members of the House of Representatives, and none came close to winning a seat in the U.S. Senate or a high executive office in any state. The charismatic Debs ran 5 times for president on a socialist ticket, but he never won more than 6% of the vote, with about 1 million ballots in 1912. At that point, the socialist movement had managed, wrote the critic and historian Irving Howe, to escape the isolation of the left-wing sect, without becoming a mass movement of enduring size and power. In the end, the working-class party was unable to woo more than a small minority of workers away from voting for politicians beholden to the capitalist class. For over a century, scholars and activists have been arguing about why it failed to make that leap. Serious debate began in 1906 with a short book, "Why Is There No Socialism in the United States?" by the German academic Werner Sombart. At the time, anyone who visited the hungry coal towns of Appalachia or the fire-prone sweatshops of the Lower East Side could have refuted Sombart's contention that incomparable prosperity, what he called wreaths of roast beef and apple pie, prevented American workers from emulating their European counterparts. So the question remained alive among historians and political scientists through the 20th century, even as the program of most socialist and labor parties on the continent came to resemble that of liberal Democrats in the United States and vice versa. Some prominent critics blamed American socialists for their own marginality, or viewed their cause as doomed by conditions particular to the nation's history. Thus, Daniel Bell contended that socialists could not relate to the specific problems of the give-and-take political world. Aileen Cratador claimed they spoke to working people as if they were the ignorant dupes of capitalism, with no ideas or cultures of their own. Louis Hartz maintained that the hegemony of liberal thought, with its vaunting of the classless individual, made Marxists politically superfluous. Many commentators have focused on the absence of a feudal past, with its deep class feelings, on ethnic and racial and religious divisions in the United States, or on the ideological flexibility of the two-party system. In recent years, scholars on the left have altered the terms of discussion. They defend the achievements of socialists as the deeds of prophets without honor in an unjust society. Nick Salvatore portrayed Debs as a union leader who gradually came to believe that monopoly capitalism was betraying the American dream. Mary Jo Buell paid tribute to the tens of thousands of rank-and-file women who formed the socialist women's movement, the defeated and now forgotten warriors against triumphant capitalism. Such views echo a remark by Mr. Dooley, the fictional Irish-American bartender created by Finley Peter Dunne, who delighted newspaper readers at the turn of the 20th century. Dooley disdained the kind of historians who, like physicians, are always looking for symptoms and making a post-mortem examination. "It tells ye what a country died of," he complained, "but I'd like to know what it lived of." Even the minority of American radicals who admired dictatorial regimes abroad spent most of their time fighting for the same causes as did the nation's scrupulously democratic socialists. The Communist Party, formed in 1919, yoked its reputation to the Soviet Union, run by Vladimir Lenin and then Joseph Stalin, one of the most repressive regimes in modern history. But their party went into swift decline during the Cold War that began in the late 1940s and barely exists today. But in their brief heyday in the 1930s and early 1940s, most rank-and-file American communists were busy advocating badly needed changes at home. During the Great Depression, they mobilized jobless men and women to demand immediate aid from the government. They organized low-paid industrial workers into such unions as the electrical workers and auto workers. They battled discrimination by race and religion and national origin. And they advocated for a good education, health care, and access to cultural resources for every American. Communists were also the most vigorous foes of fascism, except for 22 notorious months beginning in late August 1939, when the USSR signed a non-aggression pact with Nazi Germany. Knowing that the tyrants in the Kremlin approved all these activities does not negate their positive impact on American society. Ordinary members of the Communist Party helped make the U.S. a more tolerant, more democratic society, and put pressure on liberals to dismantle barriers between people deemed worthy of government help and those who were not. As part of mass movements, socialists have followed the same pattern throughout American history. They do all they can to compel elites to make reforms in the existing order. The paradox of their success is that it often limits the growth of socialism itself. Perceptive politicians understand that a rising opposition force that aims to replace the entire system has to be co-opted, not simply repressed. Take the example of progressivism in the early 20th century. This drive for reform was a tree with multiple roots. The social gospel, pragmatic philosophy, a desire for efficiency and honesty in government, and more. But the socialist challenge, with sizable parties in Europe as well as the United States, posed the promise or threat of an upheaval that would, to paraphrase the Russian revolutionary Leon Trotsky, hurl every old order into the dustbin of history. So leading figures in both major American parties shifted to the left in rhetoric and program to ensure that the essential structures of the capitalist republic would remain intact. On trips to Europe in between his 3 campaigns for the presidency, the Democrat William Jennings Bryan praised the public ownership of utilities and railroads and marveled that the German socialists have educated the working classes to a very high standard of political intelligence and a strong sense of their independence and of their social mission. The progressive Republican Theodore Roosevelt, who despised class-conscious radicals, nevertheless worked hard to steal their thunder. He declared that property shall be the servant and not the master of the commonwealth, and promoted corporate regulation and craft unions. As governor of New Jersey, Woodrow Wilson told his fellow Democrats that the service rendered the people by the national government must be of a more extended sort and of a kind not only to protect it against monopoly, but also to facilitate its life. Later in the White House, he struck up an alliance with organized labor that frustrated some socialists who had believed such a cross-class partnership was immoral. Socialists of various stripes also played a critical role in building movements during the Great Depression that helped persuade President Franklin D. Roosevelt and his fellow liberals in Congress to initiate the New Deal. General strikes in 1934, led by radicals in Minneapolis and San Francisco, nudged Congress to pass the National Labor Relations Act, which, for the first time, gave the federal government the power to punish employers for firing workers attempting to organize a union. Socialist-minded artists employed by the Works Progress Administration, WPA, created the historical murals that still exist in public buildings all over the land. And the 1935 Social Security Act, one of the most enduring and popular of all New Deal programs, built on pensions for the aged and relief for the unemployed that were already common in many European nations, where socialist parties were stronger. Even so, 2 decades earlier, it was Victor Berger, the Socialist Party congressman from Milwaukee, who introduced the first bill in Congress to provide an annual income for the elderly. Conservatives routinely condemned such programs as steps down the road to a terrifying dystopian order. In 1961, Ronald Reagan, then an actor and corporate spokesman, recorded a warning about the consequences of enacting the proposal that would become Medicare. Behind it, he predicted, will come other federal programs that will invade every area of freedom as we have known it in this country, until one day we will awake to find that we have socialism. A year earlier, Reagan wrote in the same vein to Richard Nixon about John F. Kennedy, his rival in the 1960 presidential campaign. Shouldn't someone tag Mr. Kennedy's bold new imaginative program with its proper age? Under the tousled, boyish haircut is still old Karl Marx, first launched a century ago. But when Reagan became president in 1981, he kept Medicare intact. He knew that it had become one of the most popular, as well as expensive, federal initiatives in history. Democratic Socialists have never been content with a program like Medicare that only covers a minority of Americans. They favor paying for the health costs of all citizens through progressive taxation, as well as guaranteeing them affordable housing and decent employment backed by strong unions. Yet throughout U.S. history, most have practiced what Michael Harrington, the last leader of the Socialist Party, liked to call the left wing of the possible. They were eager and sometimes able to use their talents as intellectuals and activists to spur changes that improve lives for millions of people, even if doing so did not build a radical movement. A prime example comes from Harrington's own work and career. In 1962, he published The Other America, a book that became a bestseller and brought him a measure of fame. It challenged the conventional wisdom that the nation's post-World War II prosperity left hardly any Americans in poverty. In the book, Harrington revealed that almost 1/3 of all Americans lived below those standards which we have been taught to regard as the decent minimums for food, housing, clothing, and health. He told stories that humanized the poor as people trapped in difficult conditions, not of their own making. He described them living in slum housing, suffering with chronic pain because they could not afford to see a doctor, and often going without enough food for themselves or their children. The fate of the poor, Harrington concluded, hangs upon the decision of the better off. If this anger and shame are not forthcoming, someone can write a book about the other America, a generation from now, and it will be the same or worse. He added, until these facts shame us, until they stir us to action, the other America will continue to exist, a monstrous example of needless suffering in the most advanced society in the world. Harrington was soon in great demand as a speaker on college campuses, at union halls, and before religious congregations. He appeared often on television. But the word socialism did not appear in The Other America. Harrington aimed to tug at people's consciences and urged them to take action. He argued that poverty was caused and perpetuated by institutions and public policies, not by individuals' own faults. But he did not maintain that it was caused by capitalism or that socialism would abolish it. The solution, he wrote, was full employment, more funding for housing and health care, and better schools and job training. The popularity of the book gave Harrington a national platform to talk about democratic socialism as well as poverty. He mesmerized audiences, especially on college campuses, with eloquent, funny, and morally uplifting lectures. He also functioned as a talent scout, recruiting young activists and plugging them into different movement activities. When he talked about democratic socialism, he made it sound like common sense, rational, practical, and moral at the same time. In 1964, Sargent Shriver, one of President Lyndon Johnson's closest advisors, invited Harrington to help design a new initiative called the War on Poverty. Harrington co-authored a background paper in which he argued that if there is any single dominant problem of poverty in the U.S., it is that of unemployment. The remedy was a massive public works initiative, similar to the New Deal's WPA and Civilian Conservation Corps, CCC. Harrington disagreed with Johnson, who did not want to spend the money that such a program would cost, especially while he was escalating the war in Vietnam. Harrington's stint as a government advisor lasted only about a month. But with programs like Head Start and SNAP, which provides food stamps, and Medicaid, the poverty rate did decline, and even Americans who stayed poor had access to food, health care, and aid in preparing their children for formal schooling. Since the Great Recession of 2008 through 2009, socialism has staged something of a revival in the United States. The leading organization with that name, Democratic Socialists of America, DSA, which Michael Harrington helped found back in 1982, has increased its membership tenfold to close to 100,000. Bernie Sanders, the Vermont senator who has long described himself as a socialist, ran 2 competitive campaigns for the Democratic presidential nomination. In 2021, he became chair of the powerful Budget Committee. In public opinion polls, over 2/5 of Americans say they have a positive opinion of socialism. A majority of younger Americans feel that way. After the election of 2020, some 101 DSA members held office around the country, all in progressive districts and cities. 4 were members of Congress, double the number the old Socialist Party was able to elect a century before. That nearly all these officials ran as Democrats shows they are not bent, as their adversaries on the right allege, on a revolutionary overthrow of the capitalist system. Like most of their predecessors, they dream of a far more egalitarian society, but fight for realistic goals such as Medicare for all and an economy that would run on renewable sources of energy. As Harrington liked to tell audiences, you must recognize that the social vision to which you are committing yourself will never be fulfilled in your lifetime. So his ideological progeny worked zealously to improve the country for the living. Would that it were the actual goal of every American politician.